Hi again. We are nearing the end of the Techleap Summit. This year's theme was how to scale up Dutch tech. And in that context, we have three absolutely wonderful guests who come to join us online. But before we start this closing session, first some practical information. The chat is opened, and of course, the Techleap team is present to answer all your questions. And if you want to share your stories, you can use the hashtag TechleapSummit. 3 days, 12 sessions, 42 speakers, 330 speed dates with the Techleap team, and more than 2,000 online participants. Let's take a brief look. I'd love to welcome Constantijn van Oranje, Special Envoy at Techleap, to look back at the summit so far. Constantijn, how are you?
Hi, Frankie. Very well.
Yeah, very well. We've seen many interesting discussions these past few days. What stood out for you?
Basically everything. I mean, the intensity of the conversations, founders really bringing their problems to other founders, and they're talking about them, real-life problems, real-life solutions. And we obviously had our, we had an MVP on our office hours, which was our epic fuck up. So we also had...
What happened?
Well, something happened with the platform. So it was difficult for people to engage and get onto the platform. And so some of the people have not been able to talk to our colleagues. And we apologize for that. I'm very sorry. And I'm sure we will make up. We'll find other ways to connect with you.
Next time everybody does like an Instagram, a live Instagram. You did it.
Yeah.
How was it? It was the first time, right?
Yeah, it's my first time. I'm not a big Instagrammer, so this was on our Instagram account of Techleap.
And how did you experience it?
No, it's cool. It's very direct, and it's pretty personal. So no, I like it. It's very nice.
During the opening session, you asked the ecosystem to step up.
Mm-hmm.
How are the reactions?
Well, the reactions are very positive.
Good.
Obviously, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we have to wait till how that actually translates into action. But I think there's a big willingness and a big support for the common destiny, the vision. So that's good.
Good. Well, thank you, Constantijn.
Pleasure.
Have been really kicking ass when it comes to scaling the last 4 years. And the boot that's kicking it is Kat Bourlongang, the director of La French Tech. And Kat is here with us today to explain everything about the French model. Hi Kat, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me.
What can you tell us about the French model?
The French model, well, everything. Well, maybe we should start by maybe what makes it a little bit different. Sifted is working on this article on the French tech ecosystem, and they have this rather amusing nickname for the French government. They call it the very, very visible hand. And I think maybe what makes the French model a little different is the fact that it is to a certain extent relatively engineered. You're talking about a country or an ecosystem that really went from kind of like tech backwater really just 7 or 8 years ago to a country that has, churned out, 2-3 times more unicorns than it normally does. A country that's been able to produce companies like, Miracle, that's been, raising Miracle or Back Market or Insect, and companies have been raising mega rounds year after year, and that are becoming global. And it's happened in a very short period of time.
And those investments, those rounds, are they mostly French investors too? I mean, did you manage to crank up the French VC sector as well, or is it still a lot of funding coming from abroad?
No, you have a bit of both, for sure. I think it depends on the stage, but in general, if you look at France's dependency rate on external investments, we are at roughly 20%. I think last year, the number is roughly 20% of external investments, meaning that's like the total accumulated. If you look at the total number, total amount of funding raised, which was 5.4 billion, 20% of that came from outside of France, including inside the EU. And if, just to give you an idea of what that represents, if you look over at our neighbors, Germany, their dependency rate is closer to 70%.
Mm-hmm. So that's a lot. And is that Is that in specific rounds? Is like more late stage? Did you see a lot of that? That foreign? Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the French government is very present either as a direct investor, but really much more as an LP at the early stage, especially at the early stage, because we want to make sure that entrepreneurship is accessible to anyone, really, regardless of where they come from. And then as you pick up, when you go towards like Series B, Series C, like I think once you're over Series B, something like 60% of our companies have at least one American investor, for example.
And what is the most radical of your policies?
The most radical of our policies, radical. I would say immigration, like tech immigration. France we launched this thing called the French Tech Visa, and I know all countries have their tech visas, but I think what makes ours really special is that it really allows any startup from anywhere in the world to bring in anyone from anywhere any startup from anywhere in the world that's in France to bring in anyone anywhere else, them and their families, their friends in a matter of weeks, really, and make sure that those people get residence permits that are valid up to 4 years renewable. There is no criteria for recruitment. We don't look at their diplomas. None. We don't look at their backgrounds. There's none. The only thing we look at is, well, did one of our startups want them? And of course, are they being paid at least 2 times minimum wage to avoid social dumping? But other than that, that's all we look at. And that's what actually expedites the process, the fact that you take that out of the entire sort of analysis of the application.
Was there no resistance against that, or is that just clear flying through when the policy was announced?
Yeah, it took 3 months. So the funny story is when I started this job in June 2018, and my first public speaking engagement was with the president, for whom French Tech is quite precious. And on stage, he told everyone that he really cared about tech immigration and that becoming international was a big priority for French Tech. And the Minister of Digital Affairs at the time was in the room, and he looked at him and he's like, "March, okay?" And in March it was done. So we rolled it out. We ran a few sprints. For people in the room who maybe don't necessarily understand what the back office of a visa looks like, that literally meant getting the executive degrees written, getting all of the different ministries on board, rolling out the whole application and sort of like KYC process, and all of the customer care across all of the embassies and all of the consulates and all of the prefectures in 3 months.
That's impressive, and especially considering that it's France. But
I know it's so easy for us because people's expectations are so low.
Why is that?
Like, bureaucracy will be horrible.
But why are
it'll take them 3 years?
But why are the expectations so low? Why is that?
I mean, we're coming from a pretty far place, right? Like if you look back at. So a sad story that I like to tell is that, everyone's like, oh, so what's changed in France? How come all of a sudden things have been picking up? Well, I can tell you one thing that hasn't changed. We have always had super talented entrepreneurs. It's just that, they got scared away, a little more than a decade ago by, what they considered to be a bunch of like meddling bureaucrats who understood nothing about tech and were completely anti-innovation. So if you look at some of the most impressive IPOs over the last few years, you look at like Snowflake, if you even look at like Moderna, you look at Datadog or companies like Eventbrite, those are all French founders who at that time thought that France was just not the place to be. And now they're all coming back. And I'm really happy that we have a really strong IPO pipeline this year, and then the future unicorns that have French founders will actually be French companies.
Yeah. Can you mentioned the role of your president? Is that as an outsider, you think what can't be overstated enough what his role is, but maybe that's not true. Maybe actually it's just he spends just limited time on this, but it gets extrapolated a lot, and it's really you are the engine. How does this work?
I mean, nothing gets done that's difficult in French government without strong leadership. I think that's pretty much true everywhere. So you definitely have the president that has the long-term vision and understands where we need to be exactly, and he's able to communicate that vision quite clearly, actually, really as like a CEO to everybody else. And then my boss is actually Cedric O, who's the Minister for Digital Affairs, who will then be able to sort of set the key priorities, make sure that everybody's working together. My team is actually relatively small, and the way that we're actually, like, compared to Techleap's, for example, we're only like really 15 people full time. But the difference with us, let's say if we compare ourselves to Techleap's, is that because we have that presidential buy-in, we have that leadership from Cedric O, we're actually able to bring together all of the other ministries that need to come in and help for things that matter. So for example, I don't have an international team inside the French Tech mission. We don't need one because we have the entire network of the Treasury all over the world and all of our embassies and all of our consulates. That's our international division to a certain extent. So a lot of my job really, and the job of my core team, is the part that functions a little bit more like the headquarters of the government, and everybody in the government that has a role to play in making sure that we meet the goals set by the president regarding French tech.
Let me just take me through that. I'm now, let's say, I'm a talented entrepreneur in France, and I knock on your door. Yeah. What does it mean when you say the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of the Foreign Ministry are all at your disposal? Can you take me through the journey?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so maybe one thing that's different is we are the government after all. So we're not. I wouldn't consider ourselves a service, right? We're not like a conciergerie. We're not like a VC. If we invest in the tech ecosystem, it's because we're really investing in France and France's future. So that changes a little bit how we approach things, and also the fact that we try to approach things more on a macro perspective, as opposed to supporting individual companies, of which there are like 15,000 startups in France, right? So concretely speaking, what does La French Tech do? Or at least what does the government side of La French Tech do? Because a big part of the French Tech is actually more in the tech ecosystem and the community. On the government side, like, to be very clear, the KPIs that the president has set were 25 unicorns by 2025, not at the price of diversity, not the price of the environment, and certainly not at the price of territorial cohesion. We need, when we're talking about the French tech ecosystem, it's not the Paris tech ecosystem, right? Yep. So now let's be, concretely speaking, then what is government's job? Right? If that is what we want to do, what are the things that government has to do right for us to get there? And so that really explains what we do and how we break down our tactics. One of them is on public policy. So whether it's the French tech visa or, say, the stock options reform that Cedric O rolled out last year, that was also announced by the president, all of those things are sort of somewhat coordinated by my team. There are over 50 official French tech correspondents in different ministries and different agencies, from the Banque de France to the army. There is always one person who's in charge of French tech stuff. And so that we work with them, whether it's on regulatory issues, on administrative issues, or on specific programs. There's a second thing that we do, which is maybe a little close to what you're saying, Constantine, which is that we actually do some direct support. But we do direct support rather differently. So we have this 25 unicorns thing, right? So naturally, if you're like, okay, 25 unicorns by 2025, how many potential candidates are there? I'd say maximum 120. So we have this program called, the French Tech Next 40 120, where we actually do take 120 of France's top companies. This is pure quantitative criteria, right? It's a mix of of revenue, it's a mix of growth, it's a mix of total amount of funding raised, and they have 4 people in my team, which we call startup success managers, that are essentially their go-to for anything that they need for the government. Do they really want to go to China and expand there? And have they heard that the president might be going on a delegation? Well, then we're going to get them on the same plane as the president so that they can benefit from all of the kind of really high-level networking when they get there. We took them to Davos, for example, last year as well. We took about 12 to 14 of them. Do they need to secure a really important import-export operation, then we'll have the customs work with them from day one to make sure everything goes smoothly. And if it gets stuck, they can call the French tech person at customs, who will unlock it and work with them to make sure things work. So there's a whole bunch of things like that. The requests are quite interesting. They go from like borrowing the French embassy in Mexico for an opening event, close a deal, to working with tax services because they're not quite sure how tax operations will work on VAT across Europe and things like that. And then you have the third thing, which we call the programs. So those are programs that are designed by myself and my team, and that are rolled out across the entire territory. So one example is French Techleap.nl, which is our program for diversity, which is deployed in 13 different cities across the country.
Wow, you're doing absolutely a lot. Which parts do you think should absolutely be copied by other aspiring tech countries?
Constantine and I have talked about this a lot, actually.
I thought so.
and, and I think what's very specific about how we work is that we're a relatively centralized government, which makes things, when you have strong leadership like we do with Cedric Owen, the president, then it rolls pretty smoothly, and it's really just a matter of getting everybody on board and having them feel like they're part of a bigger family. I would say that there are some just things that would be difficult for any country anyway to have a decent tech ecosystem if they haven't figured out some simple things, which are immigration, because especially in Europe, because you need a really strong international talent pool. So definitely the visa scheme is a really big deal. I think that another thing also that we do that I hope that everybody will roll out in a similar fashion is really the sheer amount of investment that we have put into diversity and inclusion. We have a lot of programs and a lot of special funding actually for founders from disadvantaged backgrounds. Because again, you can run a great tech community, you can have all the unicorns that you want. If you don't fix that, when you're especially leading a country, it's going to break right? At some point, which is not what we want.
Thank you, Kat. I think we can talk for hours more. Constantine and you would probably do that later on, right? Thank you for joining us and sharing your success story with us. We wish you a great new adventure.
Yeah, thank you, Kat.
Keep
on going.
Bye.
Our next guests are the authors of the book Blitzscaling. I proudly present to you Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye. Chris is founding partner at Blitzscaling Ventures. He is a writer, investor, and entrepreneur. Chris has had a ringside seat in the world of startups and scale-ups. Reid is the co-founder of LinkedIn, and as a partner at Greylock Capital, he was instrumental in the successes of Facebook, Airbnb, and many others. First, we will interview these great gentlemen, and then it's time for you back home to ask everything you'd like to know during the Q&A. Hi, Chris and Reid.
Hi. Good morning.
Good to see you. Good morning for you, right?
Good morning.
What time is it?
7:30 a.m. Pacific time.
Good. What made you decide to write a book together?
So the interesting thing is that Reid and I have known each other for a long time, since he was first starting LinkedIn. And we have a very dear and close mutual friend, Ben Kazanoka, who was actually a co-author with both of us on our book, The Alliance. And after having known Reid for many years, probably in 2012 or so, Ben and Reid and I got together and said, well, let's work on other things together. And so that's how we ended up becoming collaborators. And then, of course, for the book Blitzscaling, I think that's where I really want to turn it back over to Reid, because this actually stems from an experience that Reid had in Europe.
And can you explain us very briefly what blitzscaling is? Very briefly.
Well, I'll do blitzscaling and then I'll also do the European experience, because I think that was one of the things that Chris is referring to that may be particularly helpful in the European context. Blitzscaling precisely is prioritizing speed over efficiency in an environment of uncertainty. And that seems very compact, but as you unpack it, you begin to realize what the things are, which is all right, in a modern hyper-connected world that's global, actually, in fact, the first to scale, not just the first mover, the first to scale is the one that sets the ecosystem, becomes the dominant player, et cetera, so that first to scale matters. So you're prioritizing speed, and you're so much prioritizing speed, you're paying various prices in capital, but also in uncertainty. For example, questions that you may not even fully know your business model, you may not know your customer acquisition model, but still the point about being first to scale, what we refer to as in Glengarry Glen Ross markets, which is off the David Mamet play and movie, first prize Cadillac, second prize steak knives, third prize you're fired, so first really matters. And the reason we got to this was that I was on a panel in Europe, and people were explaining the secrets of Silicon Valley. And when people were saying, well, the real issue is, like here, we don't have a fear of failure. We don't have a fear of the fact that, we could play again and so forth, and so that's the only thing that you really need to do. And actually, in fact, what I realized was there was this whole scaling playbook. And so it's just like, oh, if you just got enough courage about not fear of failure, like all the scale challenges that are in front of you, we'll just fold over and you'll have all the unicorns you want. And it was like, no, actually, in fact, one of the things that Silicon Valley is a learning network, and there's a bunch of different things we've learned about which kinds of risks to take, which kinds of costs to do to accelerate speed in a successful business outcome.
Yeah.
And the world is better off if we share this everywhere. And so that's why we got around to writing the book.
Can you unpick as well your risk appetite? Because indeed, this is still the thing. Even when we look at investors in the US, they say they have more risk appetite. But sometimes it looks like they're better in managing the risk and managing the upside as well. So can you explain a bit how you would unpick risk and risk appetite? Reid or
Chris? One of the things about risk is that when it comes to blitzscaling, many people view it as extremely risky. And it's because, again, we're prioritizing speed above everything else, and especially in an environment of uncertainty.
Yeah.
But the whole principle of blitzscaling is that while it is risky to scale, there are circumstances under which it is even risky not to scale. And those circumstances occur in these Glengarry, Glen Ross markets. If you allow a competitor to achieve a dominant position, then they will probably own that market for the next several decades, and you'll have lost your chance no matter how well you do at scaling your company otherwise. So when it comes to risk management, part of it is understanding that a big risk is not taking enough risk. But then the other part of it is, this is not a license for recklessness. Simply taking on risk does not necessarily make you successful. Taking on risk intelligently, managing that risk, and finding ways to be better than your competition in terms of figuring out how to achieve your goals with taking on as little risk as possible, that's also part of blitzscaling.
I have a statement for you, and you should choose. Don't scale till the organization is in place, or start running when you have momentum and fix stuff as you go along. What do you choose?
Clearly the latter.
Very clearly, we both pick B.
Yeah.
And by the way, to amplify on the thing that Chris just said, because this is super important for everyone around these scaling ecosystems.
Yeah.
Taking risk intelligently can be one of the most critical competitive advantages. And if you're not figuring out how to take risk intelligently, e.g., you're trying to just say, hey, we try to remove all risk, we try to remove risk from our equation, and the other player, your counterparty, your competitor, is taking risk intelligently, they are likely to win the game. That's the Cadillac. And then you're playing for steak knives or you're fired.
Yeah. And Reid, you were very, very, very quick at the whole social media game, right? You were basically ahead of the curve, but you needed to do the second time to found LinkedIn and become really successful. What was your learning from that?
So in my very first startup, I learned so much that it was kind of like, there was this I never learned so much in my life except for maybe between the ages of 2 and 3. There were things every Friday that I wish I'd known on Monday. And there weren't facts in the world. There were just skills and how to play things. And part of that was the whole notion is your go-to-market strategy and going to scale and the speed of your learning curve. And to not just have learning as an individual, but learning as an organization for figuring out product market fit, figuring out product evolution. That's part of the thing that got me into writing books, speaking, other kinds of things in order to try to help, because actually entrepreneurship is, I think, how we create all the jobs of the future, the products and services. And so the more that we have it everywhere in the world is the right thing. And so that's part of the reason why when I went from SocialNet, my very first kind of startup, to LinkedIn, which PayPal was in the middle, but went to LinkedIn, I went, okay, I now know co-invent your go-to-market strategy along with your product. Start with a minimum viable product. Be embarrassed by your first product release. To learn fast as you're going. And those were all some parts of the lessons that I was learning as part of being a serial entrepreneur.
But as an investor, what is your role? What would you have expected from your investors at the time when you were making those mistakes? Would you expect your investor to step in and coach you? And my second question would be, are you, as an investor, do you prefer to work with raw talent or with repeat entrepreneurs that, that basically maybe know much of this themselves, but also maybe making other mistakes? So these two questions.
So Yeah. So on investors, look, I think part of investors, and Chris and I have done some podcasts and posts on Greylock's website and Grey Matter on this, and kind of how to select investors and board members.
Yeah.
But you really want investors who are going through with the whole journey with you. They're kind of later stage co-founders who are kind of like financial co-founders that understand upside and downside and are helping you in both circumstances. So that does mean partnering. It's mentoring is sometimes the right thing, but partnering with you on the journey, because the journey is always unique. And for me, look, I think one of the awesome things about working as an investor is just partnering with talented entrepreneurs. I like them both. I like both the young, we're just learning, but we're super inventive and we're doing things. That's one shape. That's, think of as the Apple kind of entrepreneur, and then the serial entrepreneur. The people who are like, look, I know this already. You don't need to talk to me about how to hire exec management or how to change from when we're just like kind of what we think of as what we describe in blitzscaling as a tribe, or a village-sized startup to a nation-sized startup. You know that already, and we're just working on the business problems. And so, like both of them, but the real thing for me is the soul, the commitment, the grit, the learning curve, and then wherever you are on the experience curve is great.
And what is your true north? Why do you do what you do? I mean, have been so successful already, and still you get up every morning, 6 o'clock.
Yeah, we had an early call with Chris as well, and you said that you always get up at, I don't know, is it 6:30 or earlier? But so Chris, maybe Chris, you can take this one. What makes you tick?
Let me emphasize that Reid is much more successful than me. So I will take the question anyways, because I do think that it's very important.
It's how you define success, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, speaking for myself, I think the reason why it's so important, why I'm willing to get up early and do all of these different things, is because it really resonates with the mission that I believe in. And for me, that mission is to help interesting people do interesting things. One of the reasons I work with entrepreneurs is because I think that entrepreneurs are some of the most fascinating, interesting, exciting people in the world. And they're also the ones who are solving the big challenges and issues facing the world. So when I think about the way that I can have a legacy and have an impact and leave a better world for my children and grandchildren, I really look at my work with entrepreneurs and my work with Reid and educating those entrepreneurs as one of the main important things I want to do in my life. So that's what really motivates me.
So, and Reid, last day of your life, you'd still be investing?
Oh, no. Last day of my life, I certainly wouldn't be investing. Only because investments are a 10-year horizon. So if you're in the last day, it's like...
Yeah, it makes sense.
It's like, wow, great. I mean,
you never know when the 10 years start, right? So.
Yes, exactly.
But what gives like a better feeling, being a founder and be super successful with that, or helping as an investor other entrepreneurs? Maybe
to color that, one of our successful founders here said about venture capital, it's taking a shower without getting wet. So how do the two balance?
Well, it's funny because I don't really actually have to fully choose. I've done both. I've been kind of serial founding, and I've also done investing, and I love them both. I mean, it's kind of like the earlier parts of this. I mean, when you're being a founder, you have that kind of daily, weekly cadence of building and creating something and doing with your own hands. You have to put a huge amount of time into it. As an investor, you get to work with these great founders, and you get to only work on the hardest problems with them. Yeah. But you don't get the joy of I built it. You should very clearly understand is I am helping this person, her or him, build this, and then by the way, but you get to go along on the journey. So they both have their delights.
Yeah. Chris, in this urge for speed, right? And you're building your team. I assume there's a bit of a trap there that you start hiring people that look very much like you. Because you know how they work, and when speed, you don't want to get confused by people with other opinions. So, how does the view on blitzscaling compare, or contrast with a view on diversity and having more inclusive teams and complementarity. Do they bite each other, or do you say that that diversity is really essential in getting teams that actually can blitzscale?
Well, there absolutely is a tension in the sense that when you have a group of people who all think alike, they can move more quickly. They all speak the same language, and they can more rapidly zero in on certain decisions. But I do think that there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research that shows that there's a downside to that, and that teams that are more diverse tend to make better decisions over the long run. So there is an absolute tension. The tiebreaker for us is a question we always ask ourselves about fixing particular issues. We have this principle called let fires burn, and you have to decide whether a particular fire is dangerous enough that you need to deal with it now, or whether it's something you can leave for later on. And the question we ask ourselves is this a problem that will be nearly impossible to fix at scale? Because if it's nearly impossible, not just difficult, but nearly impossible to fix at scale, then it's something that needs to be dealt with now. And diversity and inclusion fits into that category. If you think about it, when a company is just getting started, it's relatively easy to build a diverse team, especially if the founders have all along been trying to get diversity into their personal network and know people of different backgrounds who think different things, who have different experiences. But later on, if you have a company with hundreds of people who are monolithic and all look and think alike, it becomes really difficult to persuade anyone who looks different or thinks differently to come on board. So that's the reason why we believe that diversity and inclusion should be baked in from the very beginning if you can, because it becomes so much more difficult to fix as a problem at scale.
Reid, how was that for you in your companies? Did you learn in hindsight, or was this always up front in your mind when you were building your companies?
I think we learned as we went along. My very first startup, I think we were, not all men, but call it 85% men. And then also, part of what we realized is that part of what you can do as an entrepreneur before you actually get into the entrepreneurial journey is to make sure that you build more diverse networks. So that means that you don't have to make this choice of operating at speed or diversity, because then as you're bringing in people from your networks, you're still operating at speed. And that was part of the kind of lesson I learned from the very early days of social, and saying, look, this makes us a stronger, more robust culture, creates the kind of company, the kind of product that you want. So how do you have that in place so that you can both operate at extreme speed and have this? So you can do both, and that was the build your networks all the way into the entrepreneurial journey, not just treat this as, oh, look, we founded a company, we're 85% men. How do we now hire some people to try to do that and then try to build the network then? Yeah. So that was I think part of the journey of the learning of the journey.
Are there more learnings you'd like to share with the entrepreneurs and the VCs who are watching now? Like things we should really, really get into our minds?
Well, one of the things that I think is a common part of the entrepreneurship journey is that, and actually, there's an interesting contrast possibly with Europe, is that actually, in fact, you're hiring a lot of people who don't necessarily need to have 10 years of experience doing this job before. They need to have the baseline skills and then a very fast learning curve. Once you begin to realize that that is actually, in fact, a central part of a lot of entrepreneurial hiring, then actually, in fact, that gives you a natural, better lens for kind of diversity and inclusion, not just gender, but race and everything else in order to do this. Because you say, look, we don't need to say, oh, have you worked at, Cisco or Microsoft or Google or whatever for 10 years doing, this particular job. It's actually, in fact, do you have the kind of the baseline skills and tech and knowledge, whatever this function is, engineering ops, product, sales, whatever, and do you have a very fast learning curve? And that will open your aperture to include a variety of super talented people that are not that may not have the 10-year resume.
I'm going to just shift to another topic about investments and choosing your investor. So we had a bit of that discussion, and some people say you need to bootstrap longer, you retain control of your company. Others say, no, bring in an investor earlier because it helps you scale. So can you maybe both say what were your best experiences with investors and as investors? And maybe also your worst.
Start with
Chris, you want to start?
Swimming among the sharks.
Yes.
We have to be very careful with this one. But so in terms of talking about selecting your investors, I mean, the reason why you would want to bring investors in is not just the capital, although that, of course, is the reason they're investors, to allocate capital, but because when you are bringing in your investors, you're likely being able to bring in people with the kinds of skills and experiences you would never be able to hire. So instead of looking at investors as a necessary evil for obtaining capital, you can instead look at investors as a way of obtaining talents and experiences you couldn't otherwise obtain. And so in thinking about that, as I look back on my entrepreneurial career, one of the companies that I was involved with had the opportunity to bring in one of Reid's partners at Greylock, Anil Busri, as an investor. And we leaped at the chance, not just because Greylock had this incredible reputation and background, but because Anil is one of the legends in the field of enterprise software. He's one of the people who helped build PeopleSoft. He co-founded Workday, which is a huge multi-billion-dollar success. And so when we had the opportunity to get him on our board, we did it because there was no way we could ever hire him as an employee. And that was incredibly useful and powerful for us. In terms of negative experiences, I'll just say this, that probably the biggest negative experience that you're likely to run into with an investor is if that investor thinks that they can run the company themselves. And this is something that Anil was very good at, in the sense that Anil obviously knew how to run a company. He could tell anyone how to run an enterprise software company. He would offer suggestions, but he understood his place as an investor, and sitting on the board was to coach, to fill in, to support the CEO rather than to tell the CEO what to do.
What are the red flags there? I mean, you might not know that this is going to happen, right? It might you sign on your investor and then this starts to emerge. What's the red flag?
So one of the things that Reid and I both share as a principle is the importance of reference checking. Because when you're talking with someone, you talk with them, you interview them, you have a couple of hours of interaction, maybe they can fool you during that time. But if you check references with someone who's worked with that person for years and years and years, it's much more difficult. So my secret when it comes to reference checking investors is very simple. Go look up the companies that person has invested in and which have failed. And talk to the entrepreneurs and CEOs of those failed companies. Because if you talk to somebody where they failed, they've gone through the crucible with that investor. They've seen the best and worst. And if they still say that person was a great companion, was by my side, was supporting me, was sitting there helping me navigate through a very tough time, then you know that's the kind of investor you want.
Cool.
Thanks for this honest answer.
It's time for Q&A.
Yeah.
But do you have one last question?
No, I have a specific question for Reid, because obviously we don't go through your full CV, but Chris gave away that you actually are a philosopher. And I just study philosophy. So we keep saying, people, current day business, startups also always need tech. You have to have a tech background. You don't find that many philosophers in tech, I assume. And you're one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs and investors, and you are a philosopher. Maybe you can highlight what philosophy has meant for you.
For sure. So philosophy, actually, paradoxically, one of the things when I want to provoke an MBA student and say my philosophy background is more valuable than I think an MBA, and the reason is because it gave me a crispness of thinking about forming investment theses, about what is the investment thesis about the way the world is and what it's becoming. It underlies a lot of what I think of is interesting in consumer internet. So one of the things that I kind of was known for, there's a little bit of a philosophy background in the early 2000s, was saying that investing in the consumer internet is investing in one or more of the 7 deadly sins. Now, we want to transform them. We don't want to revel in them. We want to make them into the higher parts of human aspiration. There's a way of thinking. It isn't just about P&L. It isn't just about growth curves. It isn't just about CACs and LTV. It's actually about this kind of fabric of humanity. And how do you do that? And philosophy brings that in various ways. And those are the things that philosophy has helped me tune my mind to be much better, both as an entrepreneur and as an investor.
And is there one favorite philosopher?
The paper I wrote on in Oxford was Wittgenstein. And so obviously him with thought and language is very high, but there's obviously, a number of philosophers, like, one of the things, sometimes what you ask philosophers is Aristotle or Plato, and I would go Aristotle, anyway, so there's a set.
But Wittgenstein, that makes it a much more logical link to AI as well.
Yes, although the interesting question is, you can almost take modern AI and say the depth of the deep learning is actually one of the things that gets them much more of a pattern of following a rule. Now, philosophers would say that was just a non-referential metaphor, but it's still fun to do anyway.
It's time for the Q&A. The upcoming 20 minutes, we do that. And this is your chance to ask Reid and Chris everything you'd like to know. If you are watching via live stream, please ask your questions via Slido, and then the access code is 6021. And the first question here is from Carolyn, and her question is, when scaling, what is most important when it comes to company culture?
Well, one of the things that I think is super important in the company culture thing is to define it explicitly from the beginning. One of the things that founders frequently think about is they just think, hey, it'll come naturally. We are good people. We have a mission. It's not something, it's squishy. It's not something we have to put time and energy and attention into. And so what you want to do is, and it evolves. So you don't have to be like, oh my God, choose once and be ever. But like, what are some of the key things that go to what you're trying to achieve in the world? What you want your product or service to do, how you want to operate as a company. And there are, by the way, different A cultures. Some A cultures are, hey, we can tell each other that's the dumbest idea we've ever heard, and that's the way we're going to operate. Other cultures are, no, we're always building and collaborative. They have different fits for who the kinds of folks are, but who you are, it's important to define it, and it's important to start building it from the very beginning. And by the way, actually, one of the things that Chris said earlier about Anil Busri is that one of our culture episodes in Masters of Scale is actually the Anil Busri episode, who interviewed all first 500 employees to make sure that there was a culture fit, along with his co-founder, David Duffield.
Chris, you agree, right? I see you nodding.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the important things to remember about culture, and we actually have this principle in blitzscaling where we say that you should evolve your culture, is to understand that culture is not just something that is written on a set of stone tablets brought down from on high and that never changes. Culture is something that evolves, and the principal way it evolves is, just as Reid said, by the people that you hire. Each of those people, you're not hiring someone who's a clone of everyone who's already there. You're hiring someone who can add to the culture, who can bring new experiences, new thoughts, new capabilities that will make the overall culture stronger. So I think it's really important for founders to recognize, yes, of course, they're going to determine the culture, they're going to set the culture, but it's going to evolve from there. And their job is not to freeze the culture in place and keep it from ever changing, but rather to make sure that it evolves in a way that is as effective as possible.
Would Jeff Bezos agree with that?
I think he would. And I don't know Jeff that well personally, although I always joke that I worked at the company, D.E. Shaw & Company, where Jeff worked before he started Amazon. But I think you can see that Jeff has really done a great job of reinforcing the sort of culture he believes in at Amazon, while also allowing different things to bubble up. Over at the company, obviously, he has his key core philosophies of being customer-centric, his core practices of having people write memos and read before meetings. These are things that help reinforce the culture that Amazon has. And of course, the culture is very hard driving, as he is. But if you look at Amazon, I think his willingness to take a step back as executive chairman, to turn over the reins to Andy Jassy, and the fact that he's empowered these various lieutenants throughout the organization who are running different parts of Amazon, it indicates that he's willing to really allow people to evolve things. I actually have a friend, Rich Hua, who works at Amazon Web Services, and he actually has produced this series of talks for Amazon employees about emotional intelligence. It's not something you normally associate with this hard-driving Amazon culture, but these have become some of the most popular talks for employees within the company. So it demonstrates that there's room for ideas to bubble up and room for the culture to evolve.
The next question.
Just one thing. Just one thing to add on the Jeff thing. Jeff is one of those people. This is an important thing for all entrepreneurs. He's always curious. He's what we call an infinite learner. So those of us who had the delight and honor and privilege of meeting him, he starts by asking lots of questions. And that's part of his evolution, including, I think, of culture. So, sorry, next question.
Okay, cool. This question is from Robert. What are the ethical obligations a business has to society as it grows rapidly? How does it prevent having a negative effect versus being a true force of good?
So one of the things I think is really important is to realize that your ethical obligations and what your responsibilities are actually, in fact, evolve as you grow, and you should be ready for them. So we have a chapter on this in blitzscaling called, basically, sorry.
No worries.
Responsible blitzscaling.
I don't know if that's mine. And so one of the things I think that is important about this is to essentially to treat society as a customer. And obviously when you're small, that doesn't really matter. But when you're large, that does matter. And so it could be a stakeholder or anything else. And so you start planning for that. This is one of the things we put in our chapter in blitzscaling, which is you start planning for that as you're starting to get your scale to work, and you eventually quickly hire somebody, maybe at the village stage of what we're talking about, in order to grow it.
Because many tech companies from Silicon Valley have been quite slow in, for instance, developing their government affairs and public affairs capabilities, right? And we're seeing a lot of pushback now against big tech. Do you think this has been a learning in the Valley over the last years, that investing in ethics, in engaging with society, is an important part of building big businesses?
I do think so. I'm hoping that learning curve is just at its beginning and it's continuing. And from the people I'm talking to, I think I see that. I think that part of the reason why big tech so frequently looks kind of more questionable to the outside is they come and say, well, there's this real issue and you should solve this issue. And then they say, well, we're working on it. It's like, well, you're resisting solving this issue? You're like, well, actually, Jack, we have a number of different considerations. One of them is global, so there's kind of contrast between different countries and so forth. Another is like for example, not like for example, take a quick classic one on advertising and data and privacy. It's like, well, what are you doing with my data? Well, the answer is I'm providing you a bunch of free services, and part of the data allows me to get advertising that allows you to provide these free services. What has Google ever done for me? Well, free search, right? And so those kinds of things is kind of balancing out is really important. Now, that being said, it's really important, and I think it needs to be deeply internalized in all companies and all cultures, that when you get to scale and you're having society-wide impact, you have a responsibility to society, not just to your customers, but also to society. And what that is a path that we need to discover together.
Yep.
Cool. Clear. Thanks. Next question. The question is from Frank. Blitz in the US means that you have one big market. In the European Union, there are scattered markets. It means more risk to speed up because you can hit more barriers. How to adjust?
Scaling in Europe, from Europe. How do we do it?
So when you look at the history of Europe, certainly it is more challenging to not have a single domestic market, but that also brings certain benefits as well. One of the companies that we talk about in the book is a European champion, Spotify, which is the dominant player around the world in streaming music. And one of the interesting things is that Spotify actually had the advantage of being in a more isolated market at the beginning. And this allowed it to experiment with the deals with the record labels. Record labels are not willing to experiment and say, well, we'll try this out with the US market. They view that as too big to fail, something that they really can't take risks on. So there are certain advantages to being in a market like Europe where there are smaller submarkets. But on the other hand, the other thing that this does is it forces companies to much earlier in their history really think global. A company that is based in Europe can't think to itself, well, I'm just going to conquer my home country, and then after 2 or 3 years of that, I'm going to figure out how I'm going to expand to the rest of the world. A European company has to think about international expansion from the very beginning. So in that sense, there's certain benefits. But of course, as we know, there still is a tremendous power to the massive domestic market. It's why so many blitzscalers are based in either the United States, primarily Silicon Valley, or over in China. And so it's important for people in a market where they don't have that massive domestic market to think intentionally about internationalization as early as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. This question comes from Mark. Can bootstrapped companies blitzscale, and if so, how?
Well, they can, although typically blitzscaling requires a real kind of a real massive capital infusion, because in order to operate inefficiently, in terms of hiring lots of people, spending on broad growth while you're factoring out efficiencies later and so forth, you need to have a strong revenue stream. So it has happened. Google, by the way, is an example. It's not fully bootstrapped, but they didn't raise very much capital money. They got to AdWords and got profitability, had a huge revenue stream, and then blitzscaled from it. And so it is possible, but it's much harder.
And have you? So the unicorn came a bit out of favor. People say, instead of just growing market share, you have to start, becoming profitable earlier on. Do you seeing this? Is this actually a trend, or do you say no? That's just still it's about market share. It's growing as fast as possible. Let profitability follow once it's due.
Well, so this is one of the things that is a little bit of the journey, and part of got us to writing blitzscaling, which is, when the first internet boom, you had all these kind of crazy companies, which a bunch of them kind of blew up, and they said, oh, well, you had to go back to business fundamentals and, traditional industry and be profitable from the beginning and grow your profitability. And actually, in fact, that was the wrong lesson. The right lesson was some of these models, you can actually grow to profitability. You can work on your margins, work on your revenue later, and get to kind of amazing heights. And some of these models you can't. So what we did is we actually had learning within Silicon Valley. It's part of why we wrote blitzscaling to the rest of the world, to say in some of these models where you actually can go and get to scale and then build in a very powerful business later, this is the whole point of blitzscaling, you will win the market to scale. You will win the Glengarry Glen Ross market. The person who was focusing on profitability when they were a tribe or a village, something else, they're going to lose. And then you'll be able to tune it to better margins, better revenue, better profitability, and then you will be the business that is the global scalable business. And you see this in China as well. So that's a really important thing, is to say, look, profitability is the end goal of a very valuable business. But just like Amazon, you can make that much later in your career and build an amazing business.
Yeah, I'm going to take my prerogative that I'm sitting here and to overrule the Q&A by asking you a question which has been puzzling us here. Deep tech. Deep tech is seen as important. We've seen some massive breakthroughs this year, really important in medical and in many areas. Can you blitzscale deep tech? Or is there a variation? Is there a variation where you can get deep tech companies to scale much faster than they would do traditionally?
Yeah. Chris?
You can, although part of what makes blitzscaling is that it's not irrational. Like even investors, they're like, say, well, my gosh, they're putting all this money in these companies. And the answer is because they understand which of these business models that if you on a portfolio basis, you put into, kind of like 5 of them, 2 of them work, and that makes the whole portfolio really good, even though it looks like you're putting billions of dollars into a company that doesn't have revenue or doesn't have profitability yet. And so you can do it. Now, to some degree, I think one of the things that was super interesting, when you look at the pandemic, we actually saw blitzscaling responses in vaccine production.
Yeah.
We saw, like, for example, Pfizer said, look, we don't want to have government money. We're just going to do it ourselves because we want to be able to drive it entirely internally. And we're still going to drive very, very focused on safety and everything else. But we're going to do absolutely everything to make this as fast as possible as a way of doing it within safety parameters.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually, in fact, is an example of the kinds of things you can do.
Mm.
Question from Stephen. What are good examples of risks that are often overestimated? Which, in your experience, are risks that are really worth taking?
So one of the principles that we talk about in our book, and it's actually a very famous Reid Hoffman saying, is that if you are not embarrassed by your first product launch, you've launched too late. And the reason this is an issue, and again, let's be clear, you don't intentionally make a bad product. We're just saying that you need to be willing to go out there sooner rather than later. And the reason is people feel like there's this risk. You've heard these expressions. There's no chance to make a second first impression. Well, one of the companies that Reid has invested in, which has been very successful, most people are aware of, is Airbnb. And if you talk to Brian Chesky over at Airbnb, he'll tell you, we actually launched 5 or 6 times, just nobody paid attention to the first 4 or 5. So when it comes to releasing your product to the market, when it comes to getting to the market as quickly as possible, yes, there is risk in going out, and you should not take undue risks if, for example, you are a medical device manufacturer or something like that. But in many cases, taking on the risk of getting out there with something that is not fully refined is okay, because that market feedback from real users is what's going to help you get to a good enough product as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Clear. Next question. Yuma wants to know what you both do daily to develop yourselves personally.
Ooh.
Good question.
So it's a great question. And the true answer may be a little boring, which is I always try to make sure that I have interactions with someone every day that I learn something from. So it's kind of a calendar check as a way of doing it. And that's some degree is diversity of network and diversity of different kinds of experiences and kind of cognitive skill sets and zones of in the human sphere of operation. But that's the primary thing. And my secondary thing, which I don't have time for every day, similarly to that, is reading, or is getting something that is a stimulating different perspective through a different media.
And what are you reading now?
Well, I guess what I'd say, I'm reading a bunch of stuff around AI and fairly technical things, because I'm trying to understand what the next 2 to 3 years looks like.
Can you summarize that?
You'll be writing I do think that it's going to be super important. It's going to transform all industries. Like, for example, one of the things that I've actually generally tell organizations, if you have an organization of 20 people or more, you need to have a technology strategy. Technology strategy is not an IT strategy. It's not Mac versus PC or iOS versus Android. It's where are the tech trends going? Cloud, AI, mobile, synthetic biology, et cetera, crypto. Yeah. And which of those apply to what you're doing, and which should you factor into your strategy? And AI, of all of the advanced tech ones, is the one that's most certainly going to affect all industries. So basically all leaders should be thinking, okay, I don't have to do this absolutely this month, but what's going to be my AI strategy over the next 5 years? And how is the way that my company is going to be part of what the technological transformation is?
Chris, very short, what do you do to develop yourself personally? Like in 1 minute?
Absolutely. So I'll just say this very quickly. I'll reinforce what Reid said. I think reading is the key to everything. Warren Buffett has said that's what his primary activity is. And the nuance here is I think it's important to read both the things that everyone else is reading and then read the things that very few other people are reading. You want to read things that are popular to understand how people are thinking about the market, but you want to read things that are unpopular or niche in order to have insights that you can then apply. So in addition to reading things like Hacker News or Reddit, where you're going to find out what the internet is thinking about, I'll dive deep into specific topics I'm particularly passionate about, like positive psychology or perhaps the history of the Lord of the Rings, which I know Reid shares as a fan enthusiasm, in order to have ideas that are off the mainstream that may be applied in more broadly in the standard things that we do in our lives.
Is the Lord of the Rings, is that a PayPal thing?
It is actually to some degree, because Peter Thiel also has the Lord of the Rings mission. By the way, and actually, it occurred to me that one of the books that I'm reading right now for entertainment is a pre-published book, because Brad Feld and Dave Joke are actually writing a book on Nietzsche and entrepreneurship.
Okay,
they asked me to write the foreword.
Reid, sorry, I have to interrupt you. We have to stop this session, but please stay present. Thank you both for being so open and sharing your lessons with us. We've reached the end of this Techleap Summit, but Reid and Chris, please, I already asked you to stay present for the session with the RISE program community. Yes, one last comment from you, please, in that camera.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for participating in the summit. So thanks for all the speakers, but particularly the entrepreneurs that came to the sessions, shared your ideas, your fears, your whatever, and I really hope that you found what you were looking for. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I hope there'll be much more that we can give. Obviously, we're not the only source. The whole ecosystem is there to support you. Seek out the best advisors. Seek out the people that can really support you. And for now, I just want to have a big shout out for the whole team that made this happen. Thank you, Vrouwtje, for taking us through 3 days of exciting sessions. And I would invite you all to take the leap with us.
Cool. Thank you all, speakers that joined here at Techleap. I hope you enjoyed the program. Let's think big, be inclusive, and collaborate to scale Dutch tech.